I'd like to start us out with a discussion about trust. Trust is a topic that seems to be very, very central to a lot of what we do when we're talking about negotiation. And I've noticed that it's taught in different ways, it's described in different ways in the literature. There are many ways to try and wrap your heads around this topic. We're going to try several over the course of this unit. But first I'd like to start off with a story. And that story is it's a real story. Yeah, my kids always used to ask me whenever I was telling them a story, they would say, did this really happen? Because, you know, they're used to seeing movies on Disney and then the news and then their parents tell them stuff. So who knows what really happened? So yes, this really happened. A story, I think, at Johns Hopkins University about a year ago. A professor, I think he was a professor of economics, gave an end-of-term test to his students. And this teacher had a grading policy that was in the syllabus. The grading policy was that there will be an end-of-term test, and on this end-of-term test, the student who scores the highest will be given 100. And everybody else in the class would be graded on a curve down from 100. Okay? So, so this was somewhat in recognition that, you know, you can only do as best as you can do, or however you want to frame that teaching philosophy. On the day of the test, the teacher showed up in class with a big stack of test papers and sat down to wait for his students. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited. And he waited, and no one showed up. Because his students, either due to their excellent training in economics or, you know, just, I don't know how, conned on to the following idea, that if nobody showed up for the test, then everyone would get a 0. Everyone would flunk the test. And if everybody got a 0, then the highest score in the class would be a 0. And if the highest score in the class would be a 0, then the 0 would get 100 on the final grade, and everybody would get 100. It makes you think, well, you know, why wasn't I that way back? And a couple of things happened. Well, one, the first thing that I know interests many of you is, yeah, the teacher gave them 100. He turned out to be a stand-up guy in that sense. I wonder what I would have done. I can wonder about that some other time, not on your dime. But in addition, of course, the teacher changed his syllabus for the next year and figured out a better grading scheme. So in the ongoing game, circle of lifetime game between teachers and students and teachers and students, everybody learned something. However, what blew my mind about this story doesn't have to do with the teacher. It has to do with the students. Yeah. And that, I mean, for me, the question was framed of how did they trust each other? This was probably a fairly big class, several dozen, maybe more. This was you know, a big university, basic intro course. Maybe hundreds of students. How did they trust each other? That, you know, that no one would show up doubting everybody else, or just to be whatever, a goody two-shoes, or just because they think that that's actually morally perhaps the right way to do things, is when there's a test, you show up and take it. And you don't try and game the system and you know, use the teacher's own rules against them. Am I starting to sound somewhat affronted? Maybe now I do know what. No. How do they trust each other? And when I think back to the to these types of situations, when I've run them with students, you know, set them up in classrooms and let students play these games out with each other, these scenarios out with each other. Very rarely have I seen anything that resembles this kind of mass trust. How can we account for what happened here? So, so let me toss this over to you and ask, what are the types of things that you might want to know or ask about the story, about what happened, in order to understand how that worked, how that happened? This is how I'm going to frame the analysis here. What would you like to ask? So the questions that I would like to know, thinking about this scenario, are really the questions: how many students were there, what their experience was there a leader, how did he gather them together, what was the communication between them like, how many students were there, all sorts of things like that, which all are grounded in the literature on conflict and on negotiation that we know. How do groups work? How does leadership form? How does communication work? How do you coordinate cooperation in a case where, you know, competition is just begging to happen? And those are all questions that we can ask based on the frameworks we're familiar with. The tricky thing is that it still leaves me saying, huh. In other words, that I realize that even if I knew some of the answers to some of that question, and I did consider writing him back in the day, but at that point I decided that, I mean, he was being interviewed and probably rewriting his syllabus, and I figured he had enough on his mind. But that even if I knew the answers, I'd still be left with a bit of a huh. So how does that kind of trust happen? Some of it might have been trust, some of it might have been something else. But even if there was someone outside with a baseball bat, think about students you know. There would have been one student trying to climb in through the window. And I'm just kind of wondering, you know, not just how did that trust, how was there some trust or something, but how did it really manage to blanket everyone in the room? So before we get started on that, let's start off with what is trust? And trust is like one of these amorphous concepts that means many things to many people. And it's also been shown that trust is something that gets defined very, very contextually. So if you're talking about trust in the context of business, you might define it one way. If you're talking about trust in the context of organizations, you might define it another way. If you're talking about trust in the context of a discussion of philosophy, you just describe it a third way. And the same goes for negotiation. So here's one working definition of trust. And working definition, I mean one that wasn't meant to impress, but is meant to be used. Is that trust is an expectation that one's cooperation will be reciprocated. Okay, so if I cooperate, the other person will reciprocate to me. In a situation where I stand to lose if the other chooses not to cooperate. So the other can choose not to cooperate with me, and I will lose if that happens. If I still decide to cooperate with them, knowing that they could turn around and not reciprocate, then what I'm doing is trusting them. So trust involves risk, and I think that's the big thing to put on the table. Trust isn't, well, I do something and I know what's going to happen. No, I don't, given my belief of Newtonian physics, I don't trust the sun to rise in the morning. Okay, I know it will rise in the morning. Other cultures have different views towards the sun. Okay, but trust is really it's that if you're crossing a bridge and there's a slat missing, and you say, well, I'm going to jump over it and assume that I can make it. Trust is that leap of faith. So it's the tricky, ineffable, problematic thing that matters so much, but it's unguaranteed and it's a risk. Here's the problem. If you read the literature on negotiation, trust means everything. And I think that your own experiences might very well bear this out. That in situations where you do have this sense of trust in another, in other words, if you're working with someone who you feel comfortable taking a leap of faith towards, then, and it works, okay, and you are not stabbed in the back, then having taken that leap of faith, you'll encounter that other person takes leaps of faith towards you, and that you are able to work together with them. So you have trust being associated with all sorts of good things in the literature, and all of the good stuff that interest-based negotiation and integrative negotiation absolutely depends on. Because every time, when you think back to the negotiator's dilemma, every time you take a cooperative move, trust is invoked. Okay, that's what's at the core of it. However, trust isn't something you can control. And that's the scary part. You can't control it on two levels. One is, you can't necessarily force the other person into trusting you. That's one problem. And two is that you can't necessarily control your own trust patterns. That's something that we'll discuss in a minute. Trust being out of your control is a bit of a scary thing. If it is so key to negotiation, then what are we going to do if it's just this thing that happens? So we're not going to leave it at the level of something that just happens. We'll break it down, and the literature breaks it down. I hope you're familiar with some of that. But there is something scary in the fact that it's so unknown, unvague. So if you read Fisher and Urey on trust, what they had to say, at least I remember what they had to say in the second edition about trust. I don't remember whether they elaborated on it much in the third edition, but in the second edition about trust, their advice on trust was, if you don't have a good reason to trust someone, don't. That's not how trust works. That's not how people work. And so it's a good thing to keep in mind, because it reminds you to ask, wait, do I have a reason to trust them, or am I trusting them based on something else? So in other words, it's not without value, but it doesn't cut to the real core of how trust works between people. It also skips over the question, the really important question, particularly for interest-based negotiators: how do I make the other person trust me? Because that's worth gold, right? My decisions, do I trust them, do I not trust them, do I trust them, do I not trust them? How is my lie detector functioning? That's one set of considerations. But if you differentiate between my decision about them and their decision about me, well, here's one thing we can get to work on. How can we influence other people to trust us? As a negotiator, this is the treasure trove. Okay? The more trust you can engender in yourself by the other, the better you're going to do in this negotiation. Now, of course, this gives rise to ethical issues. Scam artists are great at that's what they do, at making other people trust them. So, I refer you to discussions on ethics on this, and I also say, let's assume that we're talking about something that we really do mean to hold up our side of the deal. We're really telling the truth. We're really telling whatever. Let's talk about our benevolent actions and intentions. How do we make others trust them? Goldmine. Here's a list of research that is shown. Without getting into it, it's like a list of all the good stuff. Okay? This is what trust can get you if you can manage to make the other party trust you. You can get them to solve problems with you and work with you and cooperate with you and play with you nicely in the sandbox. And it's also been shown to improve all of those things that affect these things. So it ripples out and it affects information sharing, generosity, and friendliness, and empathy, and liking, and so on. But let's get back to the practical point. Where does trust come from? Lewicki and his colleagues and others have written on this, try to break the way trust forms down into different pillars of trust or different sources of trust. The first, they talk about calculus-based trust. And calculus-based trust is, I trust you as far as I can hurt you, in a nutshell. Okay? If I'm someone standing in the doorway of that test with a baseball bat, so I trust everybody to cooperate, kind of the length of my baseball bat. If you're, I don't trust people who might be sneaking around and trying to duck in the back. I trust everybody that I can see within reach of my baseball bat not to go into the test. If we have a contract between us and we have agreed punitive damages of $1 million for anyone who breaches the contract and turns around and sells to someone else, I trust my counterpart to uphold the contract. How much do I trust my counterpart? $1 million. That's how much I trust them. And I do not trust them for $1,000,001. In other words, if someone would offer them $1,000,001, my assumption, or my calculus-based assumption, is that they will defect. Now, I also know that other things are playing here, so maybe there'll be other reasons for them to stay in the game. But from a calculus-based or a deterrence-based point of view, that's the way we look at trust. Now, some of you might easily be saying, wait, that's not trust at all. That's just punishment. That's just like, beating people up. Fear. That's just fear. And yeah. Which is funny because fear as an emotion, right? And so people are guided by fear. And this is kind of a very cognitive way of thinking about things. And indeed, this is how economists usually discuss trust. But yeah, but underlying even the economist discussion is, the underlying emotional effects of, so there's cost. And the cost, I have fear of that cost. Okay, so even when you try to isolate the cognitive elements, you're likely to slip into, wait, there's more going on beneath the surface. The second type of trust, knowledge-based trust, is the more I know about my counterpart, the more I know how he or she is likely to interact and act in given situations, the more I will trust them to act that way in those situations. The third kind of trust is the slipperiest of all. It's identification-based trust. Identification-based trust is that kind of trust that is based on the premise that the more similar we are to one another, the more likely we will be to trust each other. So while that seems to have some logical basis, yeah, if we're similar to one another, so we probably have the same values, and that sounds fine when you're talking about someone who's similar in the sense that they came out of the same womb with you, they grew up in the same house with you, went to the same class with you, and that maybe even when you look in the mirror, you see them there. Okay, so that makes sense. That if you were really, really close to being the same person, then you will have some of the same reactions, some of the same values, some of the same. However, when we speak about the full effect of identification-based trust, it means that if I go to 3 used car salespeople and I'm wondering whether to trust them about whether, the car that they're selling me, and they're all telling me it's a great car and I'll never have any problems with it, it's the best car on the market, and I know, not to give anybody a bad rap, and some of my best friends are used car salesmen, but I have this concern because everybody tells me, well, you can never trust people. So I'm trying to figure out which of them I can trust. Now I could, do an in-depth research and maybe find out that all 3 of them are upstanding members of their community, and this one is a little more than that, and try to form some kind of knowledge-based trust somehow around that. But I generally don't. Instead, what I am most likely to do is I will trust the guy with the blue eyes. Because I have blue eyes. And if I had brown eyes, well, I trust the guy with the brown eyes because they're similar to me. Now, I wish I didn't have to break the news to you, but now just imagine how many of our interactions and our trust decisions are premised on that. The answer, lots. I don't want to say most because I don't know. I'm not that kind of social scientist who actually knows the answer. Instead, I'm the kind of social scientist like, yay, lots. Let's stick with too many, okay? That means that if someone has gone to the same school as I did, I will have more trust in them than someone who did not. If someone grew up, oh, you're from Denver too? Cool, wow. So we have this instant bond and instant in-group affiliation and all that, and that includes trust. So the fact that someone, of course, when I was living in Denver, I didn't trust anybody in the street more than anyone else. But when I'm in New York, if I meet someone from Denver, they're stand-up people. And that is how we make our decisions. So sometimes it seems to make more sense. You could say if someone went to the same school as we did, so we know what that school's value system or the kind of guys who used to go to that school. Sometimes it either makes sense or you can pretend that it makes sense. And I think it's more you can pretend that it makes sense. But it really is that we base so many things on that. Now, this is important to know for 2 reasons. It's important for both of those types of trust decisions. The trust decision of who to trust and the trust decision of how to make people trust us. Okay? As far as whom to trust, I think that here is where Fisher and Urey's sentence of if you don't have a good reason to trust someone, don't, means that if you find yourself trusting someone, and that's a check-in that you can do every so often, ask yourself, well, what is that trust based on? And if you don't really know, if it's what you say, well, it's kind of like this feeling I have, which we often say, there's a very good chance that you're talking about something that is sourced in identification-based trust. And I'd suggest that that's exactly where if you don't have a good reason to trust someone, don't, and that a more kind of a trust but verify type of approach might, or a don't trust and then verify approach, depending to some extent on character and on your character and personality. But that might be a better way to go. So you can do this check-in every so often. If you remember how strong this is, you'll do a check-in. On the other side, as people wanting to get others to trust us, how can we use identification-based trust to our advantage? We can, in the room, on the spot, we can create points at which the other notices that we are similar to them, and that will engender trust in us. So if we can get better at, I mean, of course, the best way to start off is just by being trustworthy, okay? I'm going back to the ethical point. But beyond being trustworthy, how can you open the door for that person to even being willing to consider your, real material trustworthiness? By opening the door through identification-based trust, by being similar to them. If they have kids, and you do, let them know that, okay? You know what I mean? And this happens in conversation. It happens in the way we present ourselves. It happens really in the first moments of conversation